Welcome to Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Good to have you all with us once again. You know, food stamps have been a political football for a long, long time. From Reagan talking about welfare queens and Cadillacs to Clinton cutting food stamps for able-bodied adults after 3 months, to Trump's war on food stamps that heighten and tighten what Clinton did in an even greater degree for 750,000 people to stop them from being able to get food stamps. Now, these people are called ABODs. That's what they call them in this federal nomenclature, this bureaucratic nomenclature, able-bodied adults without dependents. So this is a complex question, though, involving the war on the poor. Almost half of all these folks are white, and white men at that, most of whom, many of whom, some of whom voted for Trump. But most importantly, it's the piecemeal dismantling of any aid for the working poor in our country that's taking place in front of our eyes. The Republicans couldn't get this in the last farm bill in December, so now Trump is making this a federal regulation. Joining us today is Chuck Collins, who's director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. And Chuck, welcome back. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So let's talk about that. I'm curious, talk for a minute about exactly what's happening here, how it differs from, I'm curious, a couple things. A, how it differs from what Clinton did in the 90s when he started throwing people off of, out of this same program, to the farm bill, where they couldn't get in this in the farm bill, to what the Trump administration just did. So what are we witnessing here?
Well, I think the continuity is it's the symbolic attack on the so-called able-bodied people without dependents who, seemingly are, sitting in hammocks and collecting public benefits. It's Trump's maneuver was essentially an end run around Congress. So this is an attempt to defy the will of Congress, just like building a wall. He's gonna kind of get at his. But I think it's sort of a symbolic attack to kind of go after this sort of mythology of permanent dependence, as opposed to really understanding who is it that uses food stamps, how do they use them, when do they use them, and why they're necessary.
Well, I want to answer that question. I want you to answer that question in just a second. I want to first, for you and our viewers to see this piece. This is the Secretary of Agriculture, Perdue, and what he had to say about these men and women who are receiving these food stamps.
We believe the purpose of our welfare system should help people to become independent rather than permanent dependency. We believe it does this with 6.5 million people unemployed and over 7 million jobs out there. We think, again, from the 20-hour a week of training or volunteer even or working, if people have a job that's they still qualify for SNAP, they'll still be eligible to get food assistance in that way. So we think we're helping people to again move into the dignity of work and the respect of providing for their families.
So this is part and parcel, Chuck, in many ways of this mythology, at least some people think it's mythology around that if you give somebody food stamps, they're not going to work. It makes people lazy.
Right. There's absolutely no proof that people getting food stamps, that discourages them from looking for work or finding work. It also just defies the fact that, many of the people who get food stamps are working. They often are doing seasonal work sometimes, or they're in rural areas where they're not able to secure full-time work. We're talking about average food stamp benefits of $126 a month, or like $1.40 per meal. So usually we're talking about people who are supplementing, already working or going to food pantries. And, my experience of who's on food stamps, these are elderly folks, they're in rural areas, they're veterans, they're people with criminal records that make it hard for them to get queries and get certain kinds of jobs. There are a number of barriers. It's just not this sort of simplistic idea that some people are just sitting around choosing not to work. Most people would like to work, and for whatever reason aren't always able to do that.
Well, and I think that but it also feeds into this whole stereotype about who is on food stamps, who gets the food stamps at $150 a month, whatever that number is that most people get.
Right. Yeah.
And it feeds in also in many ways into kind of this racist view of America, of lazy black folks, lazy people of color, lazy black women who will not get up and work. I mean, that seems and that's part of what these racist stereotypes are part of what push this political agenda.
No, and you mentioned going back to Bill Clinton. I mean, if you think about the general relief, I mean, many states used to actually have general relief for single individual adults who were in need. And there's been this kind of decades of systematic attack and shrinking welfare benefits. And yet we're still relying on the same old tired canard of a myth to shrink benefits, that there's somehow this little segment and as you said, Mark, these are largely rural and white. The largest percentage of beneficiaries are in those communities. And in a lot of rural areas, full-time work is not as easy to come by, even in a low unemployment rate. So, go to Maine, go to northern New England, go to the northern Midwest. These are folks who are working seasonal jobs when they can, and they're going on food stamps to get through the winter in some cases.
You're seeing this, there's another chart that shows that 48% of people who receive food stamps are white, and mostly men. And so these are important things, I think, for Americans to put their heads around about who's actually getting food stamps and why. And I'm curious how you think that. I mean, what's different between what you're seeing Trump and his administration doing now and what was originally done by Clinton? How is this heightening what's happening to the problem?
Well, I think that in some ways there's a continuity, which is the power of the myth of deservedness. Who deserves help? Where it's really interesting is that huge numbers of people have actually been lopped off of welfare since Clinton. I mean, the 1994 so-called Welfare Reform Acts, the number of people, we're talking about, 4 million people on food stamps, of which 750,000 apparently fall into this category of able-bodied. We're just talking about shrinking numbers of people, yet the mythology seems amped up. And it is part of how do you justify shrinking government? That's really the agenda that's being pushed here. How do you justify that? And continuing to sort of focus on this sort of mythological person of color who's able-bodied, who's choosing not to work as opposed to can't find work for various legitimate reasons.
And you're seeing in all of this also that just being shoved back to the states and saying that the rules that they wanted to implement in terms of a percentage of unemployment is also being changed. So it makes it even more difficult for people to get food stamps than ever before, if this is allowed to go through.
Yeah, and some states are for the proposal here is that there be a work requirement.
Right.
Or a requirement to volunteer, or that you're in 20 hours a week of job training. And states are very widely in terms of their capacity to sort of even absorb that or provide for that, So once again, it's this kind of ideological proposal that doesn't really have a basis in what states are doing in practice or able to do.
So let me play this short clip from Fox News, and I want to talk about the political ramifications after you watch this, and what is the political struggle that'll be around this particular issue.
Having work requirements for welfare or food stamps, however you want to benefit from it, whether it's housing or something else, doesn't that enable people to get out of poverty rather than stay in it?
Right. I know a lot of people on the left want to trap people in this because they will have their voting base and they don't have to work to actually focus on the issues that affect average day Americans. But the fact of the matter is this. A lot of this policies have affected my community personally. Many of the people in my community end up staying on these programs because it's a trap. It's a government trap to keep them in there. That's why the original program was to allow people to have some form of assistance, get a leg up, and not be trapped on it forever.
Well, a couple of things here. One, this is what I'm talking about the popular mythology being pushed here on Fox by this fellow Lawrence Jones and other people who do their commentary, and talking about what the origins of food stamps were in the 60s, why they came to exist, is not what they're putting on the table as to why they exist and how they're supposed to operate.
Well, Let's also remember some of the roots of food stamps was, it's in the USDA. It's actually sort of a program to subsidize the farm sector and agricultural producers. So let's go back to the real driving energy here. But it's just simply not true that people stay on food stamps for long periods of time. I mean, that's, again, the myth overriding the evidence. The evidence is people go on and off. Most people are employed. They have a rough patch and they get food stamps. It's a supplement. It's not a replacement. Most people want to work and are working to try to meet their needs. And frankly, the food stamps aren't enough to allow anybody just to live without, putting something else together. So it's just the myth trumping the reality again and again.
So finally, Chuck, I'm curious what you think happens now. I mean, what is the political battle that's going to take place both in Capitol Hill and the larger struggle around this? How do you think this plays into what we're facing in 2020 and what we're facing right now on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, this idea of these able-bodied dependent workers and making them work and they should get a job and get out of their hammock and all that really works. That's agitated and animated the Republican base for decades. That is a common mobilization strategy. So we will hear this. We will hear it at the state level. We'll hear it about the fights around Medicaid benefits, food stamps. They're going to try to attach these work requirements to able-bodied people. That will be, and then there'll be this pushback because it's just not rooted in reality. You'll see states pushing back, saying we don't want to have to administer this. This isn't this. There's a disconnect here between what you're proposing as a policy and the reality on the ground.
Can Trump's push there to accentuate what Clinton already did, can it be stopped, or is it a fait accompli?
I think Congress could stop it. I think the states could refuse to implement it if this actually is a directive that comes down. Again, it's going to be this conflict between a president who's trying to do an end run around the will of Congress, and but I think it could be stopped through congressional action.
Well, Chuck Collins, it's always great talking to you. I appreciate the work you do and appreciate you taking time with us here on The Real News. Chuck Collins is director of the Program on Inequality and the Common Good at the Institute for Policy Studies. And Chuck, thanks so much for joining us once again. It's always great to have you with us.
Thanks.
And I'm Mark Steiner here for The Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us.